Now, the situation is really, really different in a developing country. Very different. Because having any kind of secondary school education at all, even just a few years, is not a guarantee for everyone. We're so used to our system, and let's be honest, we're so used to adolescents complaining about school, getting up earlier than they want to, the daily schedule, about their teachers, about following the rules at school, about the homework. We really take for granted that no matter what your socioeconomic status in Canada, or ethnicity, or culture, or religion, or gender, you will be provided a secondary education if you want it. So we truly forget that there's a lot of people in the world for whom attending a secondary school is not possible. It's just not an option they have available to them. And your text provides a kind of case study comparing the availability and the quality of secondary school education in various countries to demonstrate this. Whoop, I went too far. Okay, so one example the text provides is North Africa. So I'm just showing you exactly what we're looking at here. And North Africa has a lot of predominantly Muslim countries. And because of this, the influence of Islam is strongly felt in their education system in terms of perspective on gender and in terms of what their education actually consists of. So this means that in these countries, schools are single sex, meaning that they're segregated by gender in separate buildings or in separate rooms in the same building, because this aligns with more conservative Islam. Now, this doesn't mean that girls are receiving the same education that boys are all along the way, because it's simply not considered as important to educate a girl as it is to educate a boy. Now, part of the reason educating girls is not considered as important is because it's common for them to be married at a much younger age than is typical in Canada. And once they're married, the home is expected to be their focus. So it just doesn't seem like common sense to perceive educating girls as valuable beyond the basics. So girls rarely have an opportunity to gain any secondary education at all. Instead, the focus is on male education. Now, globalization is having an effect. When the text cites that more than 50% of parents and grandparents in North Africa are illiterate, but that adolescents are much more likely to know how to read and write, that's a clear indication that things have changed, that rates of illiteracy have not remained the same, they have changed. It's not quick change, but it's change. And this is because, at least in part, to globalization, to outside influences having an effect on that area of the world, introducing different ideas and different ways of doing things. Now, I want you to be very aware of the dangers of being ethnocentric here. And what I mean is, we view it as positive when we as Canadians think about girls being married later and being entitled to the same educational opportunities as boys. And we view the opposite of being negative. We automatically view that culture negatively because it's so different from ours. So we're being very ethnocentric. That means we're judging another culture as inferior compared to our own. We always view our own culture as superior to another one, when it's simply different than what we're used to. Now, is it wrong to look at another culture and consider it negatively because it's not like yours? Yes, if that's the only reason. So a person could maybe say that the effect of globalization in North Africa regarding providing more educational opportunities for girls is not necessarily positive. So what I mean is they could view it negatively, that outside cultures are having an effect on their culture. And truly, this is not always a good thing. It's not always positive. Now, I think we would all agree this example is positive, that it is a good thing for globalization to increase the opportunities available to girls regarding education. But I just want you to be aware of the fact that the effect of globalization on the culture is not always positive. Um, and be aware of the fact that secondary enrollment in this area of the world is still very, very low. Now we can also look at sub-Saharan Africa, which you can also see on this map, and see that their secondary education is also extremely low. This is another area where it's just not widely available to the population. In fact, this area has the lowest rates of secondary school enrollment in the entire world. Certainly not a positive statistic. So previously we looked at North Africa. This is sub-Saharan Africa. So if we go up to this map, I'm actually pointing at my screen like I think you can see me. If you go up to this map, you see the lighter the color, the less secondary school education there is on average. So for the majority of Africa, it's very, very low. Now remember, however, we're talking about a really wide region with sub-Saharan Africa. There's just under 40 countries. So we can't make an absolute statement about the region as a whole beyond the general statistic that secondary school education on average is quite low. And clearly, this is a completely different part of the world with a completely different way of life from ours. And with that in mind, a standard formal education is simply not as useful as it is here. So reading this in the textbook, it reminded me of when I lived in Nunavut. I lived off the mainland on King William Island in a little community called Johaven, where I taught high school. And my number one problem was trying to get my students to want to have anything to do with a standard curriculum because it had absolutely zero relevance for their way of life. It just didn't, which is kind of the same principle here. Now in India, it is, in some ways, similar to sub-Saharan Africa. It's similar in that, or all of Africa, it's similar in that the education of girls is not considered as important as educating boys. And it's actually worse than sub-Saharan Africa because the illiteracy rate for girls is much higher. So if the basic illiteracy rate for girls is much higher, that indicates that not only are they usually excluded from any secondary school education, but they're often excluded from having any elementary school education. So they have no education at all, just none. Even for boys in India, only about 50% go to a secondary school, largely because of their socioeconomic status and because they live in a rural area. So in India, those are the two main factors that prevent somebody from having a secondary education. So this large, beautiful country still has quite serious problems and is still trying to implement a standard and consistently accessible education system for everyone. It just hasn't been accomplished yet. So when you look at this chart with female literacy and male literacy, you can see that it's still not a great outlook. Now, a country I'm going to talk about quite a bit is Japan, because the text also compares Japan, and it talks about the education system there in several areas of this chapter. Japan is highly advanced, fully developed, and it really is a leader in the world in several ways. And in some ways, it's very similar to our education system. So at first glance, this chart for the Japanese school system might seem complicated, but it's really not. The numbers on the side simply indicate the age at which you would normally be in that level of education. So if you look at the pink for elementary school, and the green for kindergarten, it roughly corresponds with where we are. Japan receives a lot of attention for its education system, and it's often put forth as a shining example of how to get students to really learn as much as they can. Because consistently, Japanese students outperform other countries, including the US, even though the US likes to constantly tell everybody it's the best country in the world with the best education system. In Japan, 98% of adolescents graduate from high school. That is the highest of every single Western country. Why? Is there some kind of secret they know that nobody else does? Or what is it that they do differently? Well, we can start off with the basics. And one really huge, significant difference is the amount of time spent in school. Because on average, Japanese students spend well over 200 days a year in school. Now, when you look at these statistics online, you might get slightly different numbers. I think in your textbook it says they spend 243 days a year in school. Here on the slide it says 210. So let's just focus on the fact that they spend well over 200 days a year in school. Comparably, in Canada, we spend 190, in the US, about 180. So to begin with, that's a big difference. More time in school, more time for instruction, year after year after year. And you can see here that typically the education system, the academic year in Japan, runs from April to March. So it's a little bit different school year. So they don't have any huge, massive 2-month break off for the summer. Instead, school starts in April and ends in March. And they have some smaller vacations throughout the year, but that's it. And if you think this is a big difference, it used to be even bigger. Because prior to the 90s, it was standard for students in Japan to also attend school for a half day on Saturdays. That's what all of students in Japan did. And the school days themselves were longer than they are now. It's only since the 1990s that the Saturday school day was made optional, although the vast majority of students still attend. Another difference between schools in Japan and in North America or other Western countries is that they really focus on rote learning. So this is a really key difference here. Rote learning simply means what we would probably call an old-fashioned method of learning, really focusing on repetition. It's commonly used, for example, in elementary schools here when kids learn the alphabet. That's focused on rote learning. When they learn their multiplication tables, doing it over and over and over and over until it becomes second nature. We use it here in elementary school for sight words, and sight words are simply are words that every person should recognize on sight. You don't have to sound them out, you don't have to think about it, that even in elementary school you should recognize these words on sight. We use rote learning in terms of spelling. You're expected to memorize how words are spelled, and if you make an error on your test, then you have to write them 3 times each, or 5 times each, or 10 times each. And the purpose of that is it's drilling the correct spelling into your head. But in North America, as students get older and have mastered the basics, we begin to focus on what is known as meaningful learning, which means you're not just memorizing things and being drilled in information, you're really thinking about it. You're trying to find reasons why you should learn this. You're trying to actively participate in the learning and not just be taught at. So meaningful learning, you might come across different terms for this, is simply kind of the opposite of rote learning. And you look at the pictures in the high school. So you look at this slide, picture in a typical Canadian high school. Whoop, if we go back, this slide, picture in a typical Japanese high school. Really no difference. I mean, almost no difference whatsoever. So that's a second key difference. So the first is amount of time actually spent in school, more days in school and longer school days. Second is difference in approach to learning. And in addition, a key difference in Japan is that they have to pass an upper high school entrance exam. So in Japan, junior high school includes grade 9, unlike us. For us, junior high is grade 7 and 8. In Japan, junior high is grade 7, 8, and 9. And in order to go to what they call upper high school, students in Japan have to pass an entrance exam in Japanese, math, science, social studies, and English. This is not just another exam. It's not just another test. It's not like at the end of our school year when students know they're going to have exams in their classes in high school. It's taken very, very seriously because it's perceived to be something, rightly so, that can directly determine the rest of the course of the person's life. And because of this, there is enormous pressure on students to do well, even at an early age, years before they're in high school, years before they're in the lower secondary school. Students begin to prepare for this. They might attend what are called cram schools on weekends or at night. And the purpose of this is to help them prepare for it, to cram in as much information as they possibly can. They might hire private tutors, or they might do both. And this is an extremely intense, very real academic pressure for students that can create great, great anxiety for them. As indicated in your text, this use of entrance exams for secondary school, which is also, by the way, how acceptance into the post-secondary system is determined, has created what Thomas Rowling calls Japan's national obsession. He's an anthropologist. That parents in Japan are pretty much obsessed with this, and because of this, their children are as well. That Japanese adolescents are under a level of pressure that simply does not exist in the vast majority of North America regarding their academic performance. So for the adolescents themselves, how does this affect them? If you were in Japan as a teenager, how would this affect you? Well, to begin with, you would likely spend much, much less time with your peers socializing than adolescents in North America do. And you'd probably socialize with them much, much less on social media as well. Because from a very young age, you would be expected to put in an absolute 100% effort with your academics, because you would always be expected to be concerned with preparing for the future. The entire education system there is based on the belief that all students can and will meet high standards as they progress through the years. And if you allow a student to fall behind, and if you accept failure, well, then that's going to have a domino effect, that failure kind of breeds failure. So for an adolescent, for a teenager, you would have this constant underlying need to demonstrate achievement. That would culminate, that would result in the results of your secondary school exam. So what do you think? In Canada, should we expect more of our students at every grade level? Should we expect them to really, truly master the content of their schoolwork every year? If we raised our standards and essentially say failure is not an option, do you think it would be a difficult adjustment at first, but then it would result in a better educated population? Or do you think having an education system similar to Japan's is not everything it appears to be, that it just puts too much pressure on adolescents, and that they should recognize that some people are simply not academically inclined, and that's okay? Well, it's really, really hard to figure out, and especially without seeing the Japanese system firsthand, isn't it, which approach is better? But there is no disputing the fact that when we look at international rankings of academic performance, Japanese adolescents continue to be near the top or at the top. And because of that, they're considered an example of a country whose education system is very, very effective. So there's very clear cultural differences between the education system in Japan and the education system in North America, keeping in mind that here it may vary slightly depending on exactly where you are, but it is pretty standard across Canada and the US. We spend a lot of time here discussing how to improve our education system, on education reform, whether it is limiting class sizes. Should we go back to focusing more on rote learning so that students have more basic skills? Should we revamp the curriculum so that it's more modern, or should we get back to basics? Should we assign students more homework and raise our expectations, or should we eliminate homework altogether, and so on? But when it comes to actually implementing significant change, it is almost always met with really staunch resistance. And as indicated in the text, I don't think many Canadian and American parents would be highly supportive of having a half day of school on Saturdays because in our culture, we strongly believe that kids need time to be kids. Most people here would not support students in grade 3 and up spending an hour or more on homework every single day. In fact, some people think that homework should be abolished. Most would not support simply failing students without giving them multiple chances to make up work. That's not the way the education system works in Ontario anyways. In Ontario, they do, teachers and the education system as a whole do backflips to make sure that students don't fail, even frankly, often when students are not putting in the effort they need to pass. Very few people would support a longer school day or fewer holidays and a shorter summer vacation. And in large part, all of these changes reflect cultural differences. In our culture, we view education differently. Oh, yeah, we value it, but we value it differently in terms of its role, how it should be approached, how students should be taught, what we should expect from them, all of it. Even in the US, for people of Asian descent who live there, Asian American adolescents are less likely to have a part-time job, less likely to work more than 10 hours a week if they do have a job. They're less likely to socialize with their friends as more, which also probably has a lot to do with the reason why in the US, Asian American adolescents have the highest levels of education. It's a very distinct cultural difference. So if we're looking at these different approaches to secondary education in different countries, like I said, which one's the best one? Now, first of all, when I read the title of this section in the textbook, I immediately thought, this sounds like the title of a really boring workshop teachers might be forced to attend. The characteristics of effective schools. But seriously, what can we pick and choose from different systems to make up one that would be really positive and really effective? Now, keep in mind, this doesn't refer to keeping students happy. This refers to an education system with high standards and a well-educated population. That is what constitutes an effective school.